One of the most common questions I get when speaking, especially with new groups, is, how did Bitcoin start? And the genesis of Bitcoin really came in the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. And as I'm sure many remember, it was a very turbulent time in the world. And now, here in early 2020, I'm sure most of you are feeling somewhat of a repeat of that time period. But what was especially pertinent about that time in 2007 and 2008 was a large group of people became very disillusioned about the ways that governments and especially large banks and financial institutions worked through that period. Now, it's arguable whether or not the quantitative easing that took place was really the best thing. There are certainly arguments on both sides of that. But what certainly was true was that winners and losers were selected essentially by the governments and by the central banks. As shown in this slide, for instance, the bailout of AIG um, was very large, $85 billion injected, as this headline shows. And at the same time, organizations like Lehman Brothers were left to die. And that was one of the factors that created some disillusionment. But maybe even more so was the fact that the money didn't float down into the middle class and help the people who were really being hurt at the individual level. And many people felt that the people at fault for that, certainly those behind the mortgage crisis and the explosion in the home market that caused people to ultimately get overextended, is primarily laid on the laps of people inside large banks. And so this idea of government really playing a key role in winners and losers and being in cahoots with the banks and money not floating down just created a lot of disillusionment. And so many people ended up with the perception that the establishment, if we can call it, which is kind of the combination of banks, Wall Street, and the larger central governments in the world, were either inept or corrupt or some form of both. Um, and if you think about it, the relationship of government and money, and this perception that there may be an unhealthy relationship, goes back very far in time. Now, originally, the very first coins were minted in about the 700 BC time period, and the government endorsement of the money, a stamp like this shown in this slide here with Nero. The very first one came out of Lydia and was stamped with the figure of the king of Lydia, was really as a way of saying, hey, you can trust that the gold or silver represented in this coin has been authenticated by the government. So it was a way of ensuring trust in the coin. It was a way for the government to create a mechanism for collecting taxes that was something other than barter, as well. But the idea at that time was not that the government created the money. The idea was that the government authenticated the money. So there's a big difference between those things. And for the most part, for the first several centuries, this went on okay. But the first kind of corruption of money began with Nero, where Nero, after the great fires of Rome, uh, called in essentially all of the outstanding denarius, melted it down, diluted it, and reissued it, keeping the difference between those, which was roughly 10%, um, as essentially proceeds to quote unquote fund the rebuilding of Rome. And so this was kind of the first instance of government stepping outside of being just the authentication component of money and becoming really an issuer of money. And obviously that was a big step, and many people would say the first step in the wrong direction. Now, the history of governments managing money from Nero on is not very good. Um, and so I won't go through all the details of this. There are plenty of examples available um, here: Peru, Argentina, Cyprus. Certainly, we've had Greece in recent history. So the instances of government even giving the benefit of the doubt in terms of intentions of not properly managing money are far and wide. And certainly an argument could be made economically that given enough time, government management of money will essentially always fail. And if you're sitting here listening to this video and you're from the US or the UK or Japan or some first world country with a first world economic system, those things probably don't seem very plausible to you. But if you're from a second or third world country, or you've spent a significant amount of time overseas, you might start to get an appreciation for this mindset. And I think as you examine Bitcoin, that's a very important thing to do, to step back a little bit and say, hey, instead of me as I'm sitting here in Naples, Florida, thinking about how money works and works for me, think about somebody in Syria, think about somebody in Venezuela, think about somebody in even a place like Turkey today, and see how comfortable you feel with your local currency and the relationship your government has with that currency. Even right now, and again, I won't go into the gory details, although the slide is up here if you wish to look at it in a little more detail, but Lebanon is a great case study of central banks and governments getting involved and playing games with monetary policy and their local currency and getting themselves in trouble. And I would argue that the current situation in Lebanon is essentially a Ponzi scheme that has now failed. And the news is full of protests and violence, at least I should say necessarily violence, but destruction and a lot of venom from the people in Lebanon about what's going on there. And as soon as a currency fails, the ability of a government to manage those people falls greatly. So that leads us back to what happened in 2007 and 2008, and kind of not only the short-term history going on at that time, but also the long history of government and money. And somebody writing under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto wrote a white paper. The white paper was published on Halloween Day of 2008, again, right on the heels of this turbulence in the financial world at that time. And the first line of this white paper, as listed here in the highlighted area, says a purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash that would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. The paper goes on to essentially reference that the author was creating a system that had two primary objectives. The first objective is the one I focused on thus far, which was create a system, a financial system that was disassociated from government and political influence. The second was to fight back against the enormous fees and overhead placed on the financial system by the banks and the credit card companies, and essentially beckoning a return to cash so that it creates a system ultimately so that somebody walking into a store and doing a small retail purchase, let's say for $100, um, uh, 30 years ago, that purchase would likely have occurred in cash, and it would have had two primary benefits. The first benefit would have been essentially a private transaction, at least between the merchant and the seller. Only those two parties would actually know what was going on, and the privacy of both parties would be protected by that transaction. The second would be that those transactions today commonly are executed with either debit cards or credit cards, and the $100 transaction does not result in $100 in the pocket of the merchant. It results in typically something on the order of $97. And that level of fee for the service being provided is quite a burden on the retail infrastructure. So Bitcoin, in summary, is fighting and created to solve, I would say, two primary things: government influence over money and creating that disassociation, and secondly, to create a new version of cash in the digital world. So I hope that helps give you a 50,000-foot overview of why Bitcoin exists and what impetus sat behind its creation.